Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. Welcome to today's quite timely event, and perhaps that's even an understatement, on Guatemala's elections and what's ahead of at stake as we look at the runoff on August 20th. I'm Jason Marzek, Senior Director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. With just over 5 weeks before the August 20th runoff, what will happen in Guatemala next? What's at stake now for the country's democracy in the midst of continued turmoil? Let's rewind to just the last 12 hours. Last night, the Special Prosecutor's Office Against Impunity ordered the suspension of Bernardo Arevallo's party, Movimiento Semilla, just an hour before the Supreme Electoral Tribunal confirmed that Arevallo will go to the second round on August 20th and face Sandra Torres. As Article 92 of the Ley Electoral y de Partidos Políticos establishes, a party cannot be suspended in the middle of an electoral process. The events over the last few hours come over 2 weeks after the first round of elections and after much uncertainty after Arevallo's surprise advancement to the second round resulted in delays in the certification. Today, we will unpack what it means not only for the runoff vote on August 20th, but its implications for democracy and regional geopolitics at large. Ambassador McFarland, it's wonderful to have you join us virtually from Honduras today and to share your insights. As well, former Minister of Finance, Maria Antonieta del Cid, and Fundesa's Juan Carlos Zapata, both members of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center's Central America Task Force, Movimiento Cívico Nacional's Jose Echeverria, and Atlantic Council Millennium Leadership Program Fellow, who also helped lead our delegation to Guatemala in March, and Universidad del Valle's Marielos Chang. Thank you all for joining us as speakers this morning. I'd also like to give a warm welcome to those watching today's event via ACTV on our multiple social media channels. For those in our audience who aren't necessarily following Guatemala closely, why are these elections important? And why must the United States and the international care so deeply? For one, as tensions mount, the attention has now shifted from the courts to prosecutors, from challenging the first round results to challenging Semilla's status as a party. This comes after a worrisome post-election period in which U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned that undermining the first round outcome would be a, quote, grave threat to democracy with far-reaching implications. What will be important from now until August 20th, and frankly, all the way until the January 14th inauguration and beyond, is that the democratic order and the basic rules and regulations around electoral processes be respected. Whoever wins, whatever happens in Guatemala as part of that runoff, has implications for the United States. The U.S. administration's ability to carry out its strategy towards Central America depends, of course, in some part upon who will be in Guatemala as president come January 14th. Just last month, the U.S. and Guatemala announced a pilot program intended to manage the historic irregular migration challenge impacting both countries. Guatemala, of course, also has the potential to be an incredibly important destination for companies looking to nearshore to the Americas. In this context, the Adrian Arch Latin America Center convened our Central America Task Force earlier this year with a task to map out a path forward for U.S. Central America relations that accelerates economic development, combats corruption and impunity, and contributes to Central America's future peace and prosperity. These issues are more important now than ever. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Ambassador Stephen McFarland joining us for our opening fireside conversation. Ambassador McFarland has served in a series of assignments in Latin America, focusing on U.S. support for democratic transitions, human rights, and security. He was nominated by then President George W. Bush, and he was sworn in as U.S. Ambassador to Guatemala in 2008, serving for 3 years. In this role, he led U.S. support for post-conflict human rights trials in Guatemala and also decisive support for Guatemalan prosecution of major corruption cases. So once again, Ambassador McFarland, Steve, thank you so much for joining us. And with that, let me ask you first, what do you make of the turmoil over the last 2 weeks, especially after questionable decisions were made in barring candidates during the campaign?
Well, thank you very much, Jason. Really appreciate the opportunity to join the Atlantic Council and having this very, very timely event, especially considering the measures that were announced last night. I think I think Guatemala, unfortunately, is in the process of turning into a autocratic, kleptocratic state. It's a transition that is not finished, but this election has shown both the reaches and the limits of an autocratic, kleptocratic state. And I think what we see is that the ability of corrupt interests and people associated with them to manipulate and to control the judicial structure is in fact very, very high. But what they lack is an ability to inspire excitement, interest at the citizen level, at the voter level. And that's why you have this very unusual election in which the first place vote getter really was null and blank votes, followed by Sandra Torres and Bernardo Arevalo. The second, I think, big part of the background is that voters are looking for people who are not of the system, and that explains both Arevalo's rise. That's why I would say the powers that be had arbitrarily kicked out of the race 3 candidates they thought would threaten their interests. So what you have right now, I agree with the other panelists who we've talked with informally. This is a real threat to democracy in Guatemala, and it seems to be one that Guatemalans truly care about. So the next days are going to be extraordinarily eventful and significant.
I'm picking up, Steve, on some of your points here. Events that Guatemalans care about. There's already marches planned for this morning. CACIF, the major business organization, has not only organized its own delegation to observe the elections, but also has put out numerous statements about the importance of the respecting the will of the vote and the transparency of the voting process. I think, to your point, there are many different segments across Guatemalan society, and you've seen this as well during your tenure when you were there as ambassador, who have come together and so far as defending the basic rights of democracy against those interests who are concerned about a threat to the system writ large. And of course, the events over the last couple of weeks also led to President Giammattei putting out a letter this week reinforcing that he was planning on leaving office in January. So the constant swirl of questions of what's going to happen in Guatemala continues to mount. I want to get your perspective on the events in the last 12 hours, these dueling decisions that we saw just last night, and what does that mean moving forward?
So the two decisions are, one, the announcement by the Special Prosecutor for Corruption within Public Ministry, Kurchichi, that a judge that he had opened an investigation into Semilla's formation as a party, I think over 4 years ago, and that a judge had apparently at his request asked for essentially a suspension of Semilla's membership. But now I think you can have endless debates, but I mean, as somebody who's spent a career in Central America as well as Iraq and Afghanistan, you don't have to be a weatherman to know which way the wind is coming from, and you don't need to be a Guatemalan lawyer to understand that this is basically a cooked up excuse to try to knock out Semilla. And the beneficiary, of course, would appear to be the government's candidate, who came in a more distant third. And so one would assume that although he is a bit of a lame duck, that President Giammattei is is involved in this. How much so, I don't know, because the public ministry itself has got to be concerned, or at least the people that currently run it have got to be concerned about their futures were the edifice around them to collapse. So I think this is a direct assault on the idea of a runoff election, and that it should somehow be managed. And the threat here is that you end up having a democratic system that is more of a democratic mask than anything else. It's not truly going to be challenging citizen concerns. And there are two ways that, other than indifference, there are two ways that Guatemalans can react. And one is to keep migrating north to the United States in even greater numbers. And the other one, sadly, we've seen it in other countries, I hope it doesn't get to this, is to start taking to the streets. And conceivably, taking to the streets is fine, but then the possibility of violence that at least nobody that I'm in touch with wants that. So this is extraordinarily important. I think it is important that and hopeful that CACIF and Fundesa have issued communiques, I would argue somewhat cautious communiques, but still communiques saying the right things.
Steve, you mentioned going to the streets, and that I look back at your time as around their time as ambassador. You left your post as ambassador just before the first round in the September 2011 election, an election in which Otto Perez Molina would eventually go on to win in a second round later that fall. Of course, his part of his eventual downfall came about through Guatemalans going into the street, and numbers that we hadn't seen occur in Guatemala, across society in Guatemala. But let's back up for a second. You were in Guatemala as ambassador around the time of also a contentious election. How does what you've seen transpire in Guatemala in the last few months, the last few days, size up to what you saw in the 2011 contest?
Sure, great question. I think so much has happened in the last 12 years, and in particular, so much has happened to subjugate the judiciary and the prosecutor's office to political interests in the last 12 years. That would be, I think, the big difference. One thing I do recall from the 2011 campaign, which is the first campaign that Sandra Torres wanted to run in, is that for a couple of years before that campaign, people in the Guatemalan power structure kept asking me as ambassador, "Can't you stop her? Can't you stop her? She's a dangerous leftist," was their opinion. And my answer was, we gotta, you guys have a judiciary that can interpret whether she can run or not, and the United States should not be in the business of picking candidates. It's the wrong thing to do, and it usually doesn't work out well for the United States when it doesn't. So I think the one thing that is consistent between the two periods is the U.S. is doing its best to defend the process, and it does so because it's in the best interest of the United States, I think, to defend democratic processes everywhere. There's some practical aspects in terms of migration, or in terms of usually democratic regimes are not that. Truly democratic regimes are not that prone to violence. They're not that prone to being manipulated by large outside foreign interests, but it's the right thing to do.
Given that, Steve, what should we be? And I fully agree. And I think even just last night we saw after the rulings, Assistant Secretary Brian Nichols also putting out a tweet. The U.S. Embassy in Guatemala again tweeting about the importance of respecting the democratic norms. what, looking ahead from your perspective, what should we be looking out for? What should we be most concerned about? Maybe in the next, 5 weeks leading up to August 20th, but potentially looking to the fall and beyond.
Well, I think that there are two distinct periods there. Of course, the one is, I think the first thing to that the United States, and for that matter the European Union and the OAS and others will be looking at, is the transparency and fairness of the August 20th runoff process. My guess is that the government cannot make this decision by the court and the Ministerio Público stick. It really is, I think, a bridge too far. But there are other smaller ways they can try to interfere in the election should they want to. And that needs to be observed, and it needs to be responded to, as the United States has said, essentially, if there aren't free elections, there need to be consequences. After the election, whoever wins, and I think either candidate could win. Semilla has a certain inertia to it, but Sandra Torres is also a extremely hardworking candidate. I've rarely seen a politician so dedicated to campaigning, so I wouldn't count her out either. And I think in the sort of the lame duck transition period, the focus has to be on assuring a good transition, because one would think that, well, somebody's elected, they'll take office the 14th of January. I think what is at stake in this election is much more than the party identity or even the program of the person elected president. To some extent, it's challenging the system, and I think all bets are off as to what could happen in that transition period. I think, again, the United States and European Union, OAS have huge roles to play in trying to communicate expectations and consequences.
Steve, I think that's an absolutely excellent point. As we're right now focused on getting to August 20th and getting the results initially certified from the first round, which just took place last night, and looking at the legality of decisions leading up to August 20th. But as you say, either candidate can win on August 20th, and the challenge that could pose to the system could mean actions post August 20th, similar to what we've seen over the last few weeks. And so, what does that mean insofar as the transition period as we move to January? For those who know a little bit less about Guatemala, I'd like you to share a little bit of why were people so surprised about Arevalos moving to the second round, and an anti-corruption candidate who promotes transparency, protection of human rights. Why is this so surprising in the Guatemala context?
I think, I think what made it surprising was, one, there was a general feeling that the government and its associates had this process under control. So they had invalidated the candidacy of a more leftist, indigenous-based party, that of Telma Cabrera. They had, for reasons I'm not totally sure, invalidated the candidacy of a more conservative, populist alternative, Roberto Ursu. And then all of a sudden, and this kind of shows the world we live in, there was a businessman, Carlos Pineda, who had launched candidacy, and using social media, it just took off. And he had almost unprecedented polling numbers. And I'm not saying any of these three candidates would necessarily have been great presidents. But they were knocked out. So the feeling was the government had this under control, and the polling, and Guatemala isn't the only country where people get the polling wrong, or that people just make up their decisions at the last minute. But polling did not tap into this. In retrospect, it seems that there was a lot of dissatisfaction because you had historic levels of null votes and blank votes. But some of that dissatisfaction clearly tilted towards Bernardo Arevalo, who, although just about every candidate will say you're anti-corruption, he actually had the credibility. He was actually seen as a credible anti-corruption candidate. And so, and he was seen more also as someone different. His opponents, which includes some in the private sector, see him as a symbol of quite frankly, of an apocalypse. He's the son of the president of the revolutionary era, the president that gave Guatemala social security, somebody who's democratic left, avowed democratic left, somebody who might raise taxes or get citizens more interested in demanding services that they will never get unless they migrate to the United States. So I think that's what's really shaken things up.
And Steve, and of course, Sandra Torres making it to the second round was not a surprise.
That was not a surprise. She sort of held that. This is her third time in the second round. It's her, in a way, it's her worst showing, but she should not, she should not be discounted. She is a curious person. She is driven, very ambitious, extremely hardworking. When she was first lady, she was basically the hardest working member of the cabinet. But there are a lot of people that like her, and there are a lot of people that don't like her. Mm-hmm. And she.
Steve, I want to move from. We have a few minutes left here. I want to move to the economy, and then end with looking at where do you see the bilateral relationship moving? But we do a lot of work here at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center on economic issues, importance of investment in Central America. Mm-hmm. Guatemala, of course, the largest economy in Central America, estimated GDP of over $90 billion as of a year or two ago. So and at the same time, the future president will have to tackle inflation, which has tripled between 2021 to 2022, more than 9%. Lots of poverty, incredible inequality that consistently pervades in Guatemala. Mm-hmm. How do you see this election as affecting the Guatemalan economy and also the investment potential in Guatemala?
I think I think the first question in terms of potential investors is what will the actual election process and deciding who wins say about the rule of law, which is an important aspect of the investment equation. I think clearly, if Arevalo wins, the big investors are going to be pretty cautious to see exactly what it is that he proposes, plus what it is that he, quite frankly, can do, because neither of the two candidates will have an automatic majority in the Congress, and neither will have, particularly Arevalo, will have control of the judiciary. But Sandra Torres, if she wins, would also probably merit some caution, because she has to she is not she is perhaps more associated with the status quo, politically speaking, of doing things, but she has come up with some different economic policies over the years. So I think you put your finger on it, though. The trick is, how do you generate growth and control inflation, create employment, while at the same time addressing this worsening, grinding poverty, just outrageous numbers of percentages of acute child malnutrition. How do you do that? And I think part of it is going to be the economic model, but part of it is going to be if Guatemalans can actually find somehow through the next administration rediscover what it is to be Guatemalan and to have something in common across class barriers, across race barriers, and across regional barriers.
And at the same time, exactly as you're saying, I think we'll look at what will be some of those first actions of the president-elect following the second round. What are the economic signals are put out there? Who are the ministers put forward
exactly.
for key positions? And as you say as well, how does this democratic process play out insofar the rule of law? Which obviously we're looking at the electoral implications right now, but obviously rule of law have implications for the business community. I want to ask you as we end here, looking at the U.S. Guatemala bilateral relationship. Where do you see the relationship moving? Where do you see it now? But also, how do you see election results affecting that relationship? And I think as well as we look at the Guatemala relationship, it's also important to look at the fact that, of course, the United States remains by far Guatemala's largest trading partner. But at the same time, we're also seeing a lot of push in other Central American countries toward moving from a recognition of Taiwan to a recognition of China at the same time. And so there's that question that continues to swirl as well whenever there's a new president elected. But where do you see the U.S. Guatemala relationship moving, and what needs to occur to ensure that relationship is on as positive a footing as possible moving forward?
I think great question. I think the biggest strain on the relationship right now, which is a relationship that could often be characterized as tense or poor, or trying to focus on certain short-term tactical issues where we can somehow both feel like we're getting something out of it. And I think that's because the United States has shown a fundamental opposition to this notion of increasing authoritarian rule and increasing kleptocracy in Guatemala. I think that those concerns will still exist under whoever wins it. Assuming it's one of the two people who are supposed to run in the runoff, Torres or Arevalo. I think relations will improve under either president. I think clearly Arevalo is more identified with trying to clean up the corruption and authoritarian mess, but I think the United States could work with either one, and that relations would improve. And that is important because after all, it's the largest country in Central America. There are clearly investment opportunities, trade opportunities, strategic implications that you alluded to, and of course the migration phenomenon. It's important to do this.
Oh,
but having spent time in Central America during the civil wars, there are times when I think, if the Central Americans don't get this right, if we don't get it right, that may be the future. That's what we have to avoid. We have to avoid a return to war.
Well, Ambassador McFarland, Steve, thank you so much for your time and this great opening conversation. I'm now pleased to turn it over to our next panel, with our panelists all joining us from Guatemala, and over to Assistant Director Eva Lardizábal to captain that discussion. Again, thanks, Ambassador McFarland, and Eva, over to you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Ambassador McFarland, again for joining us this morning and sharing your insights. Buenos días a todos. Como dijo Jason, mi nombre es Eva Lardizábal y soy directora asistente.
Good morning, everybody. As Jason said, I am Assistant Director. Work here at the Center for Latin America, Adrian Arsht, and I'd like to transition to the next conversation, giving the floor to several voices coming from Guatemala. It is my pleasure to present the former Minister of Finance from Guatemala, Maria Antonieta del Cid. She was also the former president of the Guatemalan Central Bank, amongst many other titles, and she's currently the dean of the economic faculty of one of the main universities in Guatemala. She's also the co-president of the working group of Central America in Guatemala. We also have with another member of that group with us, Juan Carlos Zapata. He's part of the Guatemala No Se Detiene movement. This was driven by the industrial sector. We also have Maria Los Chang, who is a professor of politics and international relations from the Universidad del Valle. And last but not least, I would like to welcome José Echeverría, who is the executive director of Movimiento Cívico Nacional, a civil society organization that through citizen activism promotes citizen education and interinstitutional transparency. Ms. Chang, Mr. Zapata, Mrs. Del Cid, Mr. Echeverría. Given what happened in Guatemala yesterday, we have a lot to talk about in the next 30 minutes. So I would like to start with what happened last night. The electoral process in Guatemala has been thrown in upheaval after a judge decided to suspend Movimiento Semilla that was supposed to go on the runoff election. This suspension came barely an hour after the CDC, the Supreme Court on Electoral, decided to question, after several delays, the results of the first run celebrated, held on the June 25th. So, Maria Los, how did we get here, and what does this mean for the next few weeks? Sorry, I think you're on mute. Thank you so much for your invitation, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for having me. The situation we're living now is very complicated. What we've seen in this electoral cycle is an extreme judicialization of the refusals, the candidates and right now we are a lot closer to defining who will be the next president of the country, and yet we still see a lot of intervention, a lot of disruption on this on the part of the judicial authorities, and I think this is concerning because what the public authorities are suggesting is illegal. They cannot just take out a party, especially after it participated in the first run. It's not constitutional. What do I mean by this? I think that they are not abiding by the law, and they have no grounds to cancel the Semilla party. I'm also concerned about the fact that, as you said, Eva, we are currently on the 17th day of delay. Other appeals have been presented, and what we're going to see here, even though the official results were acknowledged by the Electoral Supreme Court, is that we still see continuous efforts to hamper the advancement of Semilla Party onto the runoff election. So I don't think we'll be able to rest in the next few weeks. In fact, the citizens are going to be paying close attention to everybody to see what's going to transpire over the next few weeks. And we're going to have to be very careful to make sure that we'll be able to get to the runoff election on August 20th with the parties that were in the first run. I also would like to remind the people that might be following us virtually that we have interpretation available both in Spanish and English. Moving to Juan Carlos. Last night, CACIF, Fundesa, and other representatives of the companies and businessmen were emitting declarations to calling for respect for the electoral process. How do you think this is going to play into what's going to happen and beyond when we reach a decision on January 14th. Thank you, Eva, and thank you also to the Atlantic Council for allowing us to participate in this conversation. I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is that we know no democracy is perfect. In fact, Winston Churchill said it better than anyone. Democracy is the worst system of government ever designed by man, with the exception of all the others. Guatemala is facing great democratic challenges. We are a low income country, but we have great developmental challenges. We have poverty and a lot of problems also in terms of developing our public transparency. It's hard to come up with policies, or it's been hard to come up with policies that align perfectly with the development of robust and healthy judicial and social infrastructures. I think the role of companies, the role of the business sector that contributes with 93.7 to the activity, because the state actually only contributes 7% to the GDP. I think the business sector plays a key role, and this is very important in a democratic society, when what we've seen is that most of the business sector has expressed its support for the rule of law, has called for calm, and has called for a participative process where we we express our support to the Supreme Electoral Court. So it's important to acknowledge that our country ranks 99 out of 167 in the corruption index, and it's considered a democracy with a hybrid regime. And what does this mean? This means that we need to keep strengthening rule of law, separation of powers, and freedom of expression. That's why it's so important that this democratic process be respected. It's very important for our development. As a country, we have the opportunity to raise GDP to $15,000 by 2030, and to go from 16% of the GDP to 20% of GDP through actions geared towards strengthening institutional transparency. In the first round, 25% of people decided to vote null or to abstain. That's very concerning, because this is sending the message to whoever becomes the next president that we need to make important changes in our electoral law to stop this arbitrarity that was implemented in 2016, and they were nefarious for the country. Thank you, Juan Carlos. And thank you too for mentioning the null vote, because that was my next question, and actually it was the real winner. In fact, the invalid ballot surpassed the most voted candidate by over 2 points. Marielos, going back to you, how do we interpret this invalid ballot? We have also talked a lot about the malcontent of the society towards establishment. Do you think that this null vote, or people who decided to cancel the vote, can play a decisive role in electing the next president of the country? I think that what invalid ballot represents is a severe crisis of representation. We had 30 political parties participating, and yet the vote that got the most importance was actually the invalid ballot. This was 4 times higher compared to what happened in 2019. People, up around 4% people, and now 17%. And null vote, which was much lower before, became much higher now, because the citizens realized how they could cancel their own vote and not render it invalid. Another study of the Latino Barometer says that less than 30% of the Guatemalan population trusts political parties, and less than 30% of Guatemalans would be willing to participate in a political party. So what we're witnessing is a very severe crisis of political life in Guatemala, of political parties, which at the end of the day should represent the citizens and should tackle the crisis that affects us every day. There's a void in terms of the number of parties that identified as countries of parties of abiding by the rule of law, and the parties failed the people because they showed a great allegiance to the administration of Alexander Yamatei. And the presidential candidate, Manuel Conde, said it himself. He said that this alliance of different parties that have been supporting him through the last 2 years that they've been in power has been a fact. So the lesson to learn here is that we cannot wait another 4 years to create more options that represents us better. This is a call to attention, especially for those parties to reinvent themselves, to cut all ties with corruption, with criminal organizations, and closer to the needs of the citizens. I think a lot of the right-wing parties created a program or an agenda that was not really aligned with what they need, what the Guatemalans need, which is still very much centered on tackling the rising cost of living. So, in answer to your question about the importance of the invalid ballot deciding who will be the next president of the country, I think so. It's going to be decisive. Basically, half or three-fourths of the fact that if the three-fourths of those votes go to either candidate in the runoff election, it will decide who will actually be the next president of the country. Maria Antonieta, I would like to give you now the floor. The election is narrowing down to two candidates, Sandra Torres and Bernardo Arevalo. Could you tell us more about the respective public policy plans and their priorities? What would be their main drawing factors and also the main criticisms that they have attracted? Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for having me. In terms of governance plans, I looked into Bernardo Arevalo's, and I think that this plan includes some of the main key aspects in which we need to advance as a country. For example, in terms of education, he talks about different ways of improving education, improving the education's outreach through reforms, and same for healthcare. He wants to expand coverage and improve the quality of the services offered. He also includes other aspects, strengthening strengthening social care networks, improving environmental care, combating corruption. All these components have been included in his program, and it's considered a priority for him. However,
regarding how to actually go about doing this is a huge challenge. First, because reforms need to be promoted, and this was mentioned before, regarding the issue of institutional weakness in the country. This has to be addressed, and reforms have to be put through, and they have to go through Congress. However, we know that Congress will be much more divided as we see currently, given the number of parties that participated in this process. We also see the issue of financing, and we'll see how to finance the number of votes. We see that this goes beyond the budget of the country. And if you go through the whole summary, you see that there is resistance in improving the fiscal burden, which should be higher, an increase in inflation, and there should be a reduction in expenditure, but this does not balance out, because if we need more coverage in education, we need more teachers. We shouldn't just build more schools, but we also need to hire more teachers and respond also to recurring costs. So we can say that Guatemala is very rigid in its budget in view of what the Constitution determines for regular expenditures. And there are resources that have been earmarked already that are issued to development councils, municipalities, the state university, and so on. So there's budget allocations for the justice section, and we also need to cover the foreign debt and the deficit and certain things. We can say that the liquidity of the budget in this regard is over 90%. And even if we were to increase taxation income, all of this is already between 8 and 9 cents of every quetzal that's collected is already earmarked. So these are good plans, good components, but we still haven't seen how it will be done, how it will be financed. We have that how question. If there are plans to build an underground metro, for example, we know this is extremely expensive. And for this, we could add that the government period in Guatemala, in the end, is only 3 years, technically, because they will have to begin with a pre-approved budget unless they reform that budget, which has to go through Congress first. And then there's the issue of that learning curve in the public sector and how it actually works. And that will take at least 6 months' time. And then we will see elections that it's an election process that starts very early on. So this only gives you just enough time to set the foundation for actions, but I don't think huge changes in those 4 years of the next administration. Changes will occur in the medium term, and that first part of their administration, only the foundation for the work can be set. We also know that economic growth in Guatemala depends on the international context. We have had several shocks that have affected Guatemala and the world at large. And the global economy is also going through a deceleration process, not through 2023, but also through 2024, which is also seen in many, many countries globally. This will impact the growth in credit and economic growth and political issues and other issues globally that can affect globally. And in the case of Sandra Torres, I didn't find a government plan per se, perhaps just statements as to what they can implement, but they have not actually issued a government plan. They will talk about reducing the cost of basic commodities, the reduction of the utilities, social coverage plans, increase the coverage of infrastructure in Guatemala through connecting us to Honduras, for example. But we do need to understand first how that will be done, how it will be financed, and that it really cannot constitute a plan. Thank you, Maria Antonieta. Something important to see from now until August 20. Before we go back to economics, I'd like to give the floor to Jose Echeverria. You're the executive director of a national civic movement. So what is your Voto Mejor movement? What are you trying to achieve? What is the importance of the participation of citizens? Not only given the social context and the high percentage of null votes. I think that first and foremost, we need to remember that citizens are the ones that are delegating power and representation to elected officials. That is extremely important. Yo Voto Mejor is a national civic movement where we are providing tools through a collaborative platform with the participation of hundreds of Guatemalan youth that are where we identify the candidates. First and foremost, it's important to say that there is no platform for voters to actually get to know who the candidates are so they can inform their vote. So what we were trying to do is civic education. For example, what's the components of the executive, how the Congress is set up, what are the candidates for mayors, and there were debates, and these debates were organized by youth, and that's where we saw the main needs by citizens. So a commonly seen need was to improve the conditions of the local market, infrastructure like sewers and marketplaces and so on. This was an extremely interesting project where we collected valuable data. This was also a reminder at this time that it is the population, the citizens, are the ones that issue sovereignty, and this and citizen empowerment is so important. And in the past few days, we have seen how social organizations have stated that their concerns and also demanding that the Constitution be respected and that the electoral process be respected as well. We have also seen that the private sector is fully committed to strengthening a democratic republic instead of falling into authoritarianism, which is a common trend throughout the world. We also have analyzed how we are navigating democracies throughout the world, and which is an institution which is in crisis. We know that there is quite a bit of findings in the elections, mayoral elections. We saw that some of the candidates used our platform to disseminate their party. Some of them didn't want to share their information with us, but many of them took advantage of it. Thank you, Jose. So now going back to economics, Juan Carlos, there are representatives of the current government of Guatemala and the private sector signed an agreement in the framework of Guatemala won't stop, which is an agreement that you have participated quite a bit in. It's trying to attract strategic investment and strengthening export in the country. What are the impacts of this runoff election on your plan for foreign investment in general? I think this is something very, very important, because that is where you see the needs of the country to be able to attract more investment, to create more job opportunities, and this will in turn reduce migration. We have seen countries that have done something in other latitudes where as foreign direct investment increases, migration tends to decrease. This is something we have seen in Mexico and other countries where the effort to work jointly and to strengthen capacities to attract investment is quite important. This is something where we see the organized business sector is investing many $1 million in the past few years in clear efforts to provide technical proposals that will help the country to generate more direct foreign investment, not only by providing technical information, but also through actions that are helping the investment in infrastructure to create more legal certainty, and to strengthen human capital, which are the three areas where we have identified that there is a huge need to expand the debate for institutional reforms that are necessary to attract more investment and also to support sectors such as tourism to create more foreign direct investment. What we have seen in the past few years is that there's that the trend has been reverted and where we have been attracting more direct foreign investment. Guatemala has some of the highest ratings by the country risk agencies other than Panama in Central America. We have seen efforts by academia and social civil society working together with the private sector to have programs through support with the U.S. government through USAID, CABE, and other entities that are producing projects to strengthen this process. We have identified 64 infrastructure projects, which is $6.9 billion in investment that can be produced in the country, as well as scholarships in English language training to improve human capital, the reduction of legal uncertainty, which is something that needs to be worked on through reforms to electoral law, which is so important, and as well as taking advantage of the tourism industry. Guatemala has amazing tourism destinations. This is what we need to work on: how to attract investment, how to take advantage and leverage nearshoring opportunities. That is why our Fundesa has been working on with the technical teams to continue this conversation so that this can become a long-term plan towards 2030. And now, really quickly, we're almost getting to the end of the discussion. Marielos, vis-a-vis the runoff election on August 20th, what are the improvements that can be made in electoral institutions to maintain the democratic integrity of the country? Well, from now until August 20th, this will be complicated. If we see this from now till the next 4 years, so that this won't happen again in the next election, to continue reforming the electoral and the law for elections and political parties. First, we need to ensure the autonomy, independence of the electoral tribunal magistrates, and we need to ensure that they're properly elected. What does this mean? We need to reinforce the nomination laws so that they can be properly elected, so they cannot be influenced by political parties and other external agents. So the other issue is the process of how to register candidates and the minimizing the possibility of rejecting candidates so that there is no discretionality. The other issue is the election reception boards, the work done by citizens that were observing elections and minding our votes get legitimacy to the process because they were there. And it's important to strengthen these boards because they are reducing the possibility of human error that can be simply reduced by strengthening these election boards. Also, there are certain laws that can help improve the constitutional electoral process. That is the hiring law, the civil service law, the justice sector reform, and there is very little independence and impartiality in the justice sector. To date, we haven't chosen new magistrate in the Supreme Court of Justice, and this has to change. We cannot postpone this or continue dragging these reforms for more years.
Thank you very much, Marielos. And I'd like to give you the floor, Maria Antonieta, now. This electoral cycle has been plagued with surprises, and we know that the Congress is going to be very fragmented, and we were wondering how this will affect the policies of the next president. So if you could help us understand, how this could shape the policies of the next president. Yeah, I mean, when we start a new year with a new president, well, I think we are currently at the end of the mandate of the current administration. And so I think from the point of view of the economic reform, we're running out of margin for promoting said economic reforms. Guatemala could grow 3.4% precisely because of the general economic slowdown. Inflation is also slowing down, so we know that inflation had already gone down considerably according to the recent data. But let's not forget that for the citizen and for the Poles, the main problem is still the economy, employment. And I don't think we're going to see significant improvement from here until the inauguration of the next administration. In order to improve, the next government needs to set a very strong foundation and not postpone it, because new governments often do this. They start with a so-called clean slate, and that doesn't allow us to advance as a country. So whatever is working now needs to be consolidated, needs to be continued. And it's important to introduce other initiatives as well. I think Guatemala has a lot of attractives when it comes to attracting information, but we're competing with other Central American nations. We're competing with Mexico as well. And so we need to make it a priority. And in order to set the foundation, again, this was mentioned already, we need certainty, we need a safe environment that attracts investment, and we need the human capital that can respond to the needs to those companies interested in investing in Guatemala. So having people properly trained is essential. I think the next administration, be it an Arevalos or Torres administration, has an opportunity to win the confidence of foreign investors, but they'll have to come up with a series of priorities. And well, by that, I don't mean creating a list of endless things to do, but to focus on 3 or 4 initiatives and give it all they have so they can bring tangible improvement for the population. And after that, they can move on to different initiatives. Otherwise, disenchantment, disillusionment can take root very fast. Last but not least, it's very important to take care of macroeconomic stability. A lot of people take it for granted. They say, oh, Guatemala already has it. Let's just focus on something else. I would say we cannot lose sight of it. We need to take care of it. We need to support it. And we need institutions to respect it and take care of it as well. Doesn't matter who becomes president in the next elections. It's important that whoever becomes president next does all they can to strengthen institutions. And when it comes to fighting corruption, well, I think digital government is going to be fundamental. Obviously, the challenges we're facing ahead in social terms are huge. And that's why we need to establish very clear priorities.
Bueno, muchas gracias, María Antonieta.
Thank you very much, Maria Antonieta, Marielos, Juan Carlos, Jose. Thank you so much for being with us today, this morning. Eva, if I may, I wanted to say something really quick. I think given what's been happening in Guatemala these last few days, I think it's essential to highlight the importance of the different civil society organizations. And we need to also highlight the absence of declarations and statements from many political parties in Guatemala that are witnessing what's happening in Guatemala and have not said a word about what's happening. You can agree or not about what's happening, but you need to make a statement about the importance of upholding the rule of law and transparency. It's important to identify the needs of citizens and to tend to them in an urgent manner. Thank you, Jose. From the Center for Latin America, Adrian Arch, and the Atlantic Council, we believe firmly in rule of law and in the need for transparency and democratic elections expressed by Guatemalans. So with that, Maria Antonieta, Juan Carlos, Jose, Marielos, thank you so much for being with us this morning. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all of those who are following us virtually for participating in this event. Thank you so much and have a beautiful day.